Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to my friends from around the world. My name is Elizabeth Andersen and I'm the Executive Director of the World Justice Project, and pleased to welcome you today to this discussion in our webinar on access to justice for all in the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm delighted to be joined with leading experts on the issues before us today, and I'll say a few words of introduction and then introduce them and get into our discussion. Let me, just as a housekeeping matter, invite attendees to pose questions to our panel and ask that you do so using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen as opposed to the chat function. We'll talk amongst ourselves for about 40 minutes or so and then open up for questions from the audience. This webinar is part of a series that the World Justice Project has been convening in the context of our World Justice Challenge competition, a global competition which we usually convene when we are together at the World Justice Forum, but this year we are doing it virtually. And the purpose of the competition is to identify, recognize, and promote particularly effective, high-impact projects that promote and advance the rule of law. This year, the 2021 Challenge competition focuses on projects and policies, initiatives that address the particular rule of law challenges we see emerging in the context of the pandemic. And we have identified 4 areas of focus for the competition and that reflect the primary rule of law concerns that we see in this moment. Those 4 areas are accountable governance, anti-corruption and open government, fundamental rights, and access to justice. And in a series of webinars, we have been exploring the issues in each of those areas. I want to remind folks that today is the deadline for applications in the challenge competition. So if you don't have your application in yet after the webinar, you can scurry off and get that in by the end of the day today. We're eager to use the competition to crowdsource the most effective solutions to the challenges we face today. As I mentioned, today's webinar is focused on the specific issues that we are encountering relating to access to justice in the context of the pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic has illuminated very significant deficits and inequities in justice systems and how they serve people. We already knew that we had an access to justice crisis globally in work that WJP undertook a couple of years ago to map the people's everyday legal problems globally and to try to measure the magnitude of the justice gap, the number of people who lack access to justice in one way or another globally. We fixed the number at 5.1 billion people globally who have unmet legal needs. This is a eye-popping statistic and motivating. It should be motivating for all of us to use the Sustainable Development Goal process to close that justice gap. If we already had a challenge 2-3 years ago, the pandemic has significantly worsened the justice gap, taking its greatest toll on those who have been traditionally excluded from justice systems. That includes those who lack legal identity, who do not have secure land and housing rights, who work in the informal economy, who are part of traditionally marginalized or minority groups. These are the categories of people who have been most severely affected by the pandemic and the economic crisis that has come along with it. Justice problems that were most prevalent in our research several years ago: housing, employment, debt, family issues. These are also the problems that the pandemic is exacerbating. So we are facing a very stark wake-up call in this context, and very eager to identify effective, resilient solutions. And for that, we think that this challenge competition can yield very productive results. help us identify the best responses from around the world and elevate those approaches, support them, and promote their replication. To frame today's discussion, I'm very pleased to have with us 3 leaders in this field. 2 of them hail from partner organizations that have joined us as thematic partners in the World Justice Challenge. That is the International Development Law Organization and the Pathfinders for just, peaceful, and inclusive societies. We're also supported in the competition by a number of other thematic partners and benefit from financial sponsorship from our League of Law Firms and other sponsors on our website, and want to say a special thank you to them. On our panel today, we have first Maaike de Langen, who is the program lead for the Justice for All campaign as part of Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just, and Inclusive Societies, where she coordinates that global campaign among a broad coalition of governmental, non-governmental, and intergovernmental stakeholders that are advancing justice in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. In addition to Maaike, we have Zainab Malik, who's Program Development Specialist at the International Development Law Organization, where her work focuses on justice system strengthening and empowering justice seekers. And finally, I'm delighted to have with us David Satola, who's lead counsel for technology and innovation at the World Bank, where he focuses on data for development, including initiatives surrounding digital identity, and where he is also serving currently as the lead author for the forthcoming World Development Report on data for development. So we will have a couple of lightning rounds of questions for our panel, and then invite questions from the audience. Let me begin with Maaike, and then I'll turn to Zainab and David. And let's first explore what are the problems that we're trying to solve, and how are we seeing them emerge and exacerbated by the pandemic. Maaike, if I could turn to you, what in your work with Pathfinders are you seeing as the most significant access to justice problems in the context of the pandemic crisis?
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you for having me in this session, which is very timely at the end of this year that has been so different than all of us imagined when we went into it. So you referenced the global justice gap and also the most common justice problems, and both of those were developed in partnership with the World Justice Project as part of the Justice for All report of the Task Force on Justice. And those 6 most common problems, I think, are very interesting to focus on, because often when we talk about justice problems, we say, well, every country is different, every legal system is different, and that is true. But of course, the problems that people face and the problems that justice actors are trying to solve are very, very similar. So we have those 6 problems that were empirically, drawn from surveys from around the world that are sort of the baseline. But then a lot changed this year with the pandemic, and we have seen. So we've done some analysis earlier this year, one on the impacts of the pandemic on the or justice for all and the public health emergency, and the other briefing we made was on justice for all and the economic crisis. And in those briefings, we summarized basically what we saw in relation with the public health emergency. Obviously, there have been massive emergency measures taken, lockdowns enforced, and that has led to especially in those early days, but still ongoing, increasing tensions between people and justice actors about the lockdowns, about the enforcement of those lockdowns. We've seen countries in the world where that has been relatively repressive, others where that has gone better, but those are definitely a core concern. Another one, which I know Zainab will address in a little bit more detail, is of course the shadow pandemic, as UN Women has called it, the massive increase in domestic violence as a consequence of the lockdown. In relation to the economic area, we've seen both an increase and a change in justice problems that people face. In terms of increase, and I think we're still very much at the beginning of course, the economic crisis and the economic impacts have hit every country in the world, but are going to continue to lead to more problems in the area of unemployment, evictions, people in debts. And all those issues require responses. And again, well, we'll talk a little bit more about solutions later, but addressing these issues in the current context is difficult because many justice actors, whether it's courts, lawyers, paralegals, police officers, they all work under those same restrictions and public health measures that we are all facing. So let me leave it at that for now, and happy to discuss more.
Thank you very much, Maaike. That sets the groundwork very, very well for us. Let me turn then to Zainab and your work with justice systems. Maaike has outlined how legal needs are mushrooming in this context. How are justice systems responding, and what are you seeing there?
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody, and thank you for having me on this panel. Now, justice systems are both struggling, but choosing to respond in innovative ways. IDLO currently has worked in over 90 countries, and we're seeing a diverse range of responses in each of these countries. Now, it's important to note that in March 2020, when a global pandemic was declared by WHO, we also began to face another crisis, which was the crisis of injustice. Now, as Maaike has already mentioned, justice systems were forced because of social distancing measures to scale back and significantly reduce the courses of operations. Now, this didn't happen in a vacuum because, as has been highlighted, the world currently faces a global justice gap of 5.1 billion people. Now, on the one hand, you have justice systems scaling back their operations, but you have legal needs also growing as a result of millions of people being pushed out of housing, jobs, and other concerns, including the upsurge in cases of violence, especially gender-based violence. Now, one of the biggest concerns the justice systems were facing was the growing backlog because countries, particularly in West Africa and South Asia, face court backlogs of over 1 million cases. And every day that these justice systems continued to be shut, this backlog was increasing. So this motivated countries to accelerate digital innovations, including the switch to remote hearings in a lot of places. Now, you've seen justice systems really step up with unique and innovative approaches of holding and continuing to work online, not just for urgent cases, but for all kinds of hearings and to cater to legal needs of vulnerable groups as well. Now, this is not only an opportunity, but also raises a concern because the rapid digitization of justice has often been implemented in absence of safeguards for vulnerable groups. Now, the world currently faces a digital divide where only less than 1 in 5 people in least developing countries have access to the internet. So currently, we are in a situation where justice systems are struggling to address the unmet legal needs of most vulnerable groups, despite digital innovations being in place. With regards to one of the areas where digital innovations and all kinds of creative ways of addressing legal needs has been in the area of gender-based violence. Now, as Maaike already mentioned, there has been an upsurge in cases of gender-based violence. And in countries where IDLO works, we've also seen this upsurge where, for example, cases of gender-based violence has spiked by almost 50%. So more and more justice systems are responding through providing legal aid virtually and holding legal aid hearings and providing interim support and protective measures through virtual online hearings. And not only have we seen justice systems stepping up, but also legal service providers. And legal service providers are providing new and creative ways to providing legal aid and access to justice online. And IDLO has also been supporting legal service providers for gender-based violence. This includes supporting capacity of women's shelters to house more and more survivors, and to expedite processing of complaints, including the enforcement of interim measures. So this is just a snapshot of some of the innovative work that's been taken place, and I look forward to discussing it in more detail as we move on.
Great, thank you very much. So we hear, on the one hand, this kind of exponential growth in justice needs, justice systems struggling to respond, but perhaps finding in this moment some opportunities to innovate, particularly to use technology. On the other hand, that may be only a partial solution and may bring along some additional challenges, particularly for meeting those who have been traditionally excluded. And as I think David may share also some risks in technology, and maybe I'll turn then, David, to ask you to elaborate what you see, particularly in the data field and technological innovation to meet justice needs.
Great, thank you. And let me take a quick opportunity to thank the World Justice Project for inviting the World Bank to participate today. I'm delighted to be here and participate in this panel. So I did want to focus my initial remarks on the data aspects related to the pandemic. We also have been doing some research, as Zainab and Maaike have already talked about the effects on the justice system of the lockdown and the move of everything, almost every aspect of our daily lives online. One of those, the results of that phenomena is that the internet is now more exposed than it ever has been. And our data is also subject to exposure as well. In the context of the pandemic, we knew that data was going to be incredibly important in managing and understanding the spread of the disease. And so as a global emergency, there were obvious data needs. At the same time, this posed this probably single biggest ever modern data collection exercise posed real threats to individuals and their control over personal data. And what we found was that there were great disparities, both at the global level and the national level, in how these data were being treated, which made managing the pandemic more difficult, because what we found in our research, for example, in the upcoming World Development Report, is that where there's trust in the system, where there's trust that the data that an individual might contribute would be used in a responsible way, and where the individual would have some degree of agency over his or her data, it's more likely that that data will be contributed and then used and reused for those purposes. So we knew going into this, and we did finance as an institution COVID responses in a number of countries. I don't know the exact number. I think it's somewhere north of 60 and a little bit south of 100. But we put in a lot of financing to ensure that there was as much possible tracking of the disease as possible and monitoring where it was going. But we found that in countries where there wasn't already a data protection regime, the disparities that existed could have gotten worse. And even in countries where there was a data protection regime, many countries passed emergency legislation that either suspended or abrogated those data protections for a period of time. So we saw what was already, as Zainab discussed, a kind of digital divide grow even wider and more apparent. So, with respect to these emergency regulations, we're looking to see some sunsetting clauses that for as long as they were in place, that they needed to be in place for managing the pandemic. But when that need passed, that then those emergency regulations should fade away. We also found that sort of basic data protection principles of data minimization and use of data for specific purposes were being challenged. And so we wanted to ensure that where data was being collected for health purposes. It was used for health purposes and not for other purposes that were not intended or not legitimately related to that. And that only those data that were really necessary to perform those health functions would be collected, so that it wasn't an excuse for opening a door on surveillance generally beyond medical surveillance. And so I think we've seen what we tried to do in our projects was identify where countries had data protection regimes in place, and if they were adequate for those purposes, we could use those. Where countries didn't have those regimes in place, we included some necessary patchwork in order to have a proxy of that data protection framework, at least with respect to data that was being collected and used and reused and processed in terms of the pandemic.
Great, thank you very much for that. So we see in this context, of course, emergency responses, maybe with all the right intent, but real risk of unintended consequences. And so one of the things we might be looking for in our competition is smart solutions that are incorporating protections against some of those unintended consequences. That's a good segue to circling back around. And if I can start again with you, Maaike, and ask my panelists to maybe elaborate a little bit more now that we've identified some of the challenges and problems that we're seeing in this context. Give us some hope, help us identify some of the most promising solutions that you're seeing around the world and that we all might seek to replicate. Maaike, can I start with you?
Sure, and let me just add to what some of the previous, what Zainab and David have said as well in terms of response. And I think as we look into the next year and what it will bring, I think people are fairly optimistic that at some point the pandemic will be under control, and we will be able to reopen some of the justice services and restart some of the normal interactions. Nobody knows exactly when, but I do think that is coming. And then a key question, of course, becomes what of the emergency measures do we want to keep, and which ones do we want to tweak or end or change or benefit from? I do think we have seen in the past year, because of the stresses of the pandemic, people have to find solutions. Justice actors, whether it's judges, paralegals, police, etc. Prisoners. Somebody asked a question about prisons in the Q&A. So both how the management of the prison system and protecting both the prisoners and the people working in the prisons. So I think there has been a lot of pressure to find those solutions, which has led to more collaboration, more innovation than we've seen in a long time, and more creativity. And I think those are good developments, and we'll have to go through it, because every innovation has its downsides. David pointed to the risks of data protection. Obviously, some justice problems you're fine with, or justice issues, legal needs, you're fine with resolving online. If you want to register your car, it's totally fine to do it as efficiently as possible online. However, if you're getting married, you'd rather have an in-person ceremony than some kind of Zoom wedding. So I'm just saying that I think we're going into that reflection, and there has been a lot of learning and experimenting around the world. The other thing I'd say is that, we've called it the triple crunch in some of our analysis, in a way. If you have this increase of justice problems, still restrictions, at least for the first half of the year, I think we can reasonably expect, and public resources and generally people's resources under pressure. So we'll need a lot more of that creativity, and specifically for addressing those backlogs. I think that's really a challenge we should all take up together, in the sense that, we can sit back and see the backlogs increase, see the cases pile up, see the procedures take longer. But if we're thinking also about economic recovery, a lot of these issues, the quicker we can resolve them, the more justice actors and justice systems can actually support that economic recovery, resolve issues, and move on. So that requires much more proactive attitude where we can ask people to anticipate the demand that is coming, which is not something typically done. Invest in original solutions. If you know that there's so many cases that are basically the same, maybe you can find more standard ways of dealing with them, more personal ways of resolving conflicts, preventing some of the problems that you can anticipate. So I think there's a lot of strategies. There's much more on this in our briefings, but a lot of strategies I think that have been developed and need to be continued. Would you like me to give a couple concrete examples now, or shall we do a first general round and come back to the actual examples later?
No, why don't you go ahead and give us a couple of examples?
Okay, so I mean, these are just, there's so much happening out there, but one of the things we were really impressed with, and we actually have an interview on in our Champions of Change series with the Community Advocacy Legal Center in Canada, which is a legal aid center that serves people's needs in quite a broad area. And when the pandemic hit, they had to move very fast, transition to online working and online service delivery, which has all kinds of logistical questions very quickly. They developed, they kept an open eye to what the problems were that people were facing, developed a resources page where people could find the information they needed. And the thing I found most spectacular actually about that example is that right in those very early weeks, they did a survey. So, going back to our theme of justice data, they thought, well, everything is changing. We don't really know what problems people are facing right now. So let's do a survey. Let's ask our clients, our target group, what the issues are, what they want us to do. And out of that, they informed their strategy. And I think that attitude of being focused on legal needs of people, trying to find the data to understand what the issues are, and then tailoring your solutions, I think is one of the examples I found particularly inspiring. We have that, as I said, in our Champions of Change interview. So for whoever wants to read more, the link is in the chat. And other, this is not just Canada. That's one that I know a little bit more about in detail, but there's other examples like this around the world, especially legal empowerment organizations have created resource pages like Hak Dar Shak in India. They've created a web portal and an app to ask questions also on how to access COVID relief, which was also a very prominent question and urgent question for many people around the world. So I think that creativity is there, and like I started out with, that's something we can build on and keep the good, continue to reflect on downsides and improvements and learn from each other.
Great examples, and really illustrative of the power of data, as you suggest, particularly at a moment when we see just this monumental demand and overwhelming systems and a need to prioritize. Data can really be critical in developing solutions and setting priorities. So that's a helpful insight. Zainab, what are you seeing as promising solutions that we might elevate to our audience today and to our competition?
Great. No, I mean, first of all, I would like to echo some of the things that Maaike said. And I really feel that in the justice sector, the theme of this year, especially in response to COVID-19, is how quickly they've shifted gears from once upon a time saying that things take many, many years to change. Whereas this year, what we've seen is some very rapid innovations taking place. And I believe that a lot of these innovations have been in attempts to respond to the crisis, but actually offer a basis for opening up more conversations about long-term and sustainable solutions. And I can already cite some promising concrete examples that IDLO has seen in some of the countries that it already works in. So in a number of countries, for example, Somalia, Honduras, and Kenya, we've seen justice actors, including representatives from the judiciary, the ministries of justice, civil society, and legal service providers, convened very quickly in order to assess the situations under their respective national justice systems and come up with strategies to respond to them on the basis of the legal needs that emerge as the crisis is developed. So we see national coordination mechanisms sort of leading the way for COVID-19 response. In addition to that, what we've seen is that in coordination with civil society and justice actors, there has been a focus on enhancing the capacity to respond to the emerging legal needs. And taking the example of gender-based violence, for example, in Mongolia, what IDLO is seen is that the increase in requests have been responded to by development of expertise. And this includes, for example, coming up with handbooks on legal advice and legal assistance for survivors on domestic violence. We've seen our partners hold live streams through Facebook and through other forms of social media to inform and provide advice to survivors of domestic violence who would otherwise be confined within the four walls of their home and not be able to access some of those remedies. We've also seen creative ways of conducting public legal awareness campaigns geared towards reaching out specifically to survivors of domestic violence. We've also seen in a lot of countries, such as, for example, Tunisia, virtual legal aid mechanisms pop up, which try to connect legal service providers directly with the victims and create sort of referral pathways. So there is coordination between both entities and they can come into contact with each other depending on various situations. We've also seen, and somebody already mentioned here, the case of prisons. For prisons, we've already seen legal aid providers enhance their efforts to ensure that procedural safeguards are respected in prisons. And this specifically, I'd like to cite the case for pre-trial detainees who are currently serving out their terms in prisons, even though those terms have expired, but they cannot bring their cases to court because courts have scaled down operations. So we've really seen legal service providers, for example, in countries like Afghanistan, step up and litigate directly to the courts or conduct awareness raising campaigns to ensure that the procedural and substantive safeguards for these detainees are respected. These are just a few of the solutions that have been emerging, but great work is being done all over the globe. And I believe that in a competition such as the World Justice Project, it provides us with a great platform to take stock of various solutions that are coming up and try to understand how we can replicate them and make them more sustainable as we move forward. Thank you.
Wonderful. Lots of good examples there of responsive justice systems and innovation against a backdrop of all these challenges, which is so important to rebuilding and establishing trust. I was struck, David, as you were talking at the outset about the threats to trust in this context. And we've certainly seen the importance of trust in institutions for societies having an effective response to a challenge like the pandemic. And I think that's a critical thing for us to keep in mind in this as we think about effective access to justice solutions. What are you seeing, David, as the most effective responses?
Well, again, focusing on the role of data and especially personal data in managing the pandemic and individuals' rights around the use and reuse of their data. I think one of the things, and I don't know if this is a solution or if it's one of our silver linings that we'll talk about in a minute, but I think one of the things that the pandemic did was it took these somewhat abstract notions of what data protection might mean and what responsible use of personal data might be. And it really made them concrete, I think, for a lot of people. People who hadn't really thought about it before necessarily, either in the context of maybe using social media or something else, but when it came to something as important and as vital, literally vital as health, that it made a real difference. And where I'm going with that is I think that one of the solutions that's required, and these are kind of two sides of the same coin, I think, is the digital and data literacy of ordinary citizens about what their rights are in their data and what the limits and the tensions are around the use of that data. On the other side is the capacity building of institutions and organizations and systems to manage these new data that are being collected. I don't think that one is really effective without the other. And I think that in order for citizens, we as global citizens to be aware of what our rights are around our data, in order to control the use of those data, we need to know what those rights are and what the extent of those rights are, what the limits are. So we need to be data literate about what we do. And on the other side, we need institutions that have the capacity to understand how to manage those uses, the uses of our data. And so in our projects, all of our COVID emergency projects, we had built in a specific component that financed capacity building for data management in countries. This was a limited, very focused capacity building enterprise with respect to health data. But I think that it showed the importance of not just saying, oh, data protection is important, or access, or ensuring that our rights and data are important, but it also gave effect to that through institutional human capacity building to manage those data. And I think that that's really important going forward. I think it was an important lesson that we learned in the pandemic. And I hope that going forward in other applications that with respect to data, that those lessons learned will be transferred to sectors beyond the health sector.
We often look to the health sector as a source of learning for the justice sector. So maybe that will indeed be something we benefit from coming out of this. Let me, you previewed, David, where I want to go, which is the silver linings. When we finally come through this, what do you not want to change? What are the ways in which we are improving that we don't want to reverse? And how has this crisis catapulted us forward in a way that we want to hang on to?
Is that back to me? Okay, great, thanks. So I'll take my own segue into my own segue then. No, I think I would return to this question of the level of awareness that now exists around these issues globally, and in corners of the world where we wouldn't necessarily have thought that they would obtain any purchase. I think that the issues now are well understood. It's not really a question anymore whether these data rights are important. It's a question of how they're managed. And I think that the combination, I think, of having kind of 2 years of experience now with the EU's General Data Protection Regulation and the impact that that has had around the world on other countries updating their data protection laws, along with the really focused reality of how data can be used to improve lives has resulted in a sea change in how people think about data, about personal data in particular. And all of the issues that we would have focused on in our World Development Report about establishing a trust environment where for development purposes there are certain enablers for data usage, but there are also safeguards to ensure that both personal and non-personal data are used according to their purpose, was put really, again, into this very real and not abstract context. And I think that with respect to how the discussion will go forward about how do we return to a path to normal, what are the ways that we sort of deconstruct the emergency regulations that were put in place, not just for data, but for other things. How do we make sure that in the future, and there probably will be other pandemics, when other emergencies arise, that we structure these approaches in a way that they meet the terms of the emergency, but they're temporary, they're proportionate, there's a path towards getting back to a normal practice. I think the other silver lining that's come out of this is this has, at least again in the health and pandemic context with respect to personal data, it has really put into sharp focus why we need global standards for data and how global standard could really help in managing, especially in a global pandemic context, the use and reuse of data. So I hope that coming out of that we'll see, I'm relieved that the vaccine is coming out, we all are, but I hope that when we're all inoculated and back to normal, that we don't forget that there are still these needs that we have in terms of establishing standards for rights, standards for justice, and that just because we're not dealing in an emergency context, that they're still not important. So while we have, I think, the momentum to start to address these issues, I also hope that once the emergency passes, that we don't lose our focus on these very important issues. Thanks.
Critical caution there, and hope for the future. Let me reverse order and go to Zainab. And because I want to leave time, we've got lots of long questions in our Q&A, maybe ask you a lightning round, 1 minute. What's your silver lining? What don't we want to reverse when this is over?
Well, I mean, I think that this has been an important wake-up call for us all, in the sense that, well, when the pandemic hit, we weren't living in a just world. And the realization now that the pandemic has highlighted and exacerbated some of the inequalities, especially given the unequal way that its impacts are being felt across different communities, for example, women, migrants, refugees, and other and across different countries, what we realize now that we really need to rethink the way we've been thinking about justice and implement reforms if we're going to stay on track for the realization of the 2028 Sustainable Development Goal agenda. Now, I mean, it's very easy, as David said, that once we all get inoculated, we can say, oh, okay, the pandemic is now over, let's go back to life as it was before. But what's important to recognize is that pre-pandemic, we were dealing with a justice gap of 5.1 billion people. And is that something that we want to go back to? And so the recognition that there needs to be a rethinking of the way the formal justice system is working. We need to come up with new and innovative ways of delivering justice. And these could be exploring possibilities, for example, informal and customary justice, alternative dispute resolution mechanisms, and how we can recalibrate justice delivery to ensure that vulnerable groups are really at the forefront of having their legal needs met, rather than falling within that gap, which grows bigger and bigger over time. Thank you.
Great. So we're going to emerge with a world that uses data and uses it well and wisely and fairly and justly. We're going to emerge with an innovative justice system that's responsive to people's needs. What do you see, Maaike, that will be better after we come through?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of work to be done, but I do think both what Zainab described in terms of you know, the pandemic and you know, the much more shared understanding of how unequal and unjust our societies were pre-pandemic and how that has really been exacerbated. But in parallel with that, of course, you had the whole movement for racial or against racial discrimination, with, you know, sparked by the Black Lives Matter movement in the US, but which has really found global resonance. And I think those two sort of growing awareness, two areas of growing awareness of injustices that have seemed sort of part of life as normal. I don't think you know, people will go back to considering those normal, and so I think that's both you know, that's powerful. That's a basis, a platform for change. It's also you know, it's something that really needs to be answered. And I think at the global level, there's a lot of discussion now about rethinking social contracts. How can we really restructure in a way those social contracts so that we can build back better. Of course, one of the key terms after the pandemic, in a way that we can actually achieve those SDGs. The pandemic has been a setback for the achievement of the SDGs. The goals are still out there. There's still, I think, a very ambitious agenda that can guide us in our work. So how can we build on? But again, the demand is there, the urgency is there. And I think this year, the innovations, the creativity that has been necessary, the rethinking of what is really the essence of what we're doing. Can we do it simpler? Can we do it quicker? Can we, again, a simple example, I heard very early on that there was a justice, I think it was Ireland, where they still had a roll call every morning. So the court still had a roll call. You have your court case maybe was at 4 p.m., but you had to show up at 9:30. I mean, that was always insane, I would say, in this day and age, but suddenly it's off the table. So there's examples like that of things that have now changed. And I think if we can build on that change, bring it together with the demand for change, then I can remain an optimist, the optimist that I am.
Wonderful. I'm going to turn to my colleague Joel Martinez to share with us some of the questions. There are lots in our Q&A feed there, but Joel, maybe you can give us a few questions, well, maybe 2 or 3, and then we'll go do a round for the panel to respond.
Perfect. Thanks, Betsy. And thanks everyone for submitting such great questions. There are a few themes that emerge here in these questions that I'm going to try to highlight. I'm going to paraphrase these just because people have put a lot of context around them. So if you want to read the whole thing, jump in the Q&A. The first theme that comes through is on improving the justice system for prisoners and reducing overcrowding. I know that's come up a little bit, but there's some interest in hearing more from the panelists on how to reduce overcrowding and provide better legal services and justice for detainees and prisoners. And someone adds specifically about children in prisons coming up there as well. So that's one point that comes through. The second theme that I'm seeing is here on maybe non-technology solutions to some of the problems that we've been discussing. So someone asks, while digitalization of justice is a welcome step, it is well pointed out that the informal and offline ways to bridge the justice gap are also needed. So what are some of the ways that have worked in increasing efficiency and innovations within the national justice system from a non-technology perspective? And building on that, someone also flags, how have legal actors been able to reach remote areas without internet? So I think that's one other thing. And then finally, the third one really has to do here about coordination among justice actors. We have a question that says, what lessons can the panel share on the use and coordination of justice chain actors, adaptations to effectively respond to justice needs? What are some of the examples of coordination? And I think they're specifically thinking here on police, prosecution, prisons, in addition to the actual court systems. So there you go. Those are 3 that come through. I'll turn it back over to you, Betsy, in the panel.
Super. I'm going to invite my 3 panelists to answer any or all of those. And maybe to mix up the order, can I start with you, Zainab, this time? We've got a question about prison conditions in particular and legal aid in prisons, non-technological solutions, and coordination among justice actors. And I might, a friendly amendment, also invite reflection on coordination among between justice actors and non-justice actors. What are the roles that we at WJP like to say that the rule of law is not just for judges and lawyers? What are the contributions that non-lawyers can also make in coordination here? So Zainab, any or all of those questions, your thoughts?
Great. Okay. So, I mean, I'd like to answer them all, but I won't because we'd be here for a long time. So starting with the question on improving overcrowding in prison and access to legal aid. So, I mean, it's worth noting that a few days after the WHO declared a global pandemic, one of the things that it highlighted was that prisons were really going to emerge as the hotspot of the spreading of the virus. And they were not wrong, because 1 month after the pandemic was declared, we had over 14,000 reported cases of infections in 14 countries all over the world, with over 400 deaths. And this included both prisoners, but also people who work in prisons, including prison guards. So some of the ways that countries responded was to stop visitation. This included from families, but also from lawyers. And this created some of the problems that I highlighted earlier, which included, for example, the pre-trial detention terms expiring, people spending more time in prison than they were supposed to, but also led to great psychological impacts on prisoners who essentially felt isolated. And this includes juvenile defendants who weren't allowed to visit either families or lawyers. So this is, countries have responded to the problem of overcrowding by setting out criteria for ordering immediate release of certain categories of prisoners. This includes women, pregnant women, children, people accused of minor crimes, those on pretrial detention. In certain countries, these numbers have crossed more than 50,000 people. So the processing of the releases themselves has taken a long time, with the impact that prison populations, instead of decreasing, have actually ended up increasing in a lot of countries. So the solution for that is essentially rethinking the way the penalization and punishment and sentencing system works across the board, across different justice systems. We need to, clearly this crisis, one of the things that has shown is that the way incarceration is practiced across most countries of the world is not working, and potentially holds serious public health risks for prisoners, which go above and beyond the punishment that they're already continuing to serve. So one of the things that IDLO has highlighted in its policy brief on COVID-19 and rule of law is to come up with alternatives to detention, come up with different forms of punishments that can be served instead of incarcerating people for long periods of time. And this is especially given that most countries on average take over 10 years for the resolution of certain criminal cases. So people end up serving that time as well. So if these prisoners could be released in a matter of a few days, maybe they shouldn't have been in prison in the first place. And that's something that we should think about going forward. So the next question.
Zainab, I'm gonna cut you off there. I'm sorry, but we're coming to the end of our hour and I want to hear from our other panelists their thoughts on the questions. But a great example, again, of a silver lining that we are through this crisis, rethinking incarceration. David, can I turn to you for your thoughts on any of the questions?
Yeah, just a couple closing thoughts. And I wanted to pick up on a couple of the questions that were in the thread as well. And relating, I think, to the sort of analog foundations and the sort of digital applications of law, and how to prioritize where, we should focus access to justice concerns. I think one of the challenges to ensuring in the modern age that in the face of some of the technologies, we have laws that are durable in the sense that they're future-proof and not linked to any particular technology is a big challenge. But I think that's really important, especially in addressing these questions about what are the basic protections that need to be in place. In my case, the things that I focus on are access to information, freedom of expression, and data protection. And these are all included in the international human rights instruments. And so, I agree with the questions that have been asked about, well, we really need to focus on these basic justice aspects first before we can bother about data protection. I have a certain degree of sympathy for that. However, I think what this pandemic has focused us on is that a new thing can come along that does pose a threat to basic rights, and that in some countries without protections being put in place for data, that the excuse of using an emergency surveillance measure to gather data ostensibly for health purposes could be used for nefarious purposes. So I think there's definitely a link to that. There was another question about how people access the internet these days, and I think the question is correct that not everyone accesses it through a laptop or a computer. More and more people, especially in the developing world, are accessing the internet via smartphones, and this this phenomena will only continue with the rollout of 4 and 5G technologies across the globe. So we do need to pay attention, I think, to, again, I will turn to my data literacy point that, we as digital citizens need to be aware of what our rights are and ensure that those rights via our institutions are being protected. And I'll stop there. So thanks very much.
Great. Thank you so much. Maaike, I'm going to turn to you for the last word on any of the questions that Joel posed or that are in the feed.
Thank you. No, just to, I won't say much about prisons, just very much echo Zainab's comments on that. And I do think it is a very sensible question. If we can release these people, why were they there in the first place? I also think it's a good natural experiment to get more data about what happened and in those different contexts. And on children in prison in particular, I mean, I think the scientific evidence is quite overwhelming that children shouldn't be in prison, period. And so that's definitely an area of concern. We have my colleague posted in the chat interview with a Bangladeshi judge who really worked in the early days of the pandemic to get a lot of prisoners out, and also specifically children who were in prison. The other thing, just on the non-technology solution and the actors working together, I think there are. I think if you start changing the mindset and the focus of the justice system and the justice actors to what the legal needs are that people have, what the justice problems are they are facing, and you take a solution-oriented approach to that, looking at, okay, so these are the problems, what are the solutions they need individually, but also what are the solutions we need as a society, what are the outcomes we're striving for, then that automatically brings with it a broader understanding of who are the actors you need to work with. So yes, of course, courts and judges, they always have a role, but it's a small role. There's many other actors, paralegals, I've mentioned them before, lawyers, social protection workers, health workers. So, if you take that perspective, you broaden that group of relevant actors, and then you can start building either chains. There's examples. I know one from Mali, and other one from the Netherlands. I heard one from Ireland of really different actors coming together, not each doing their little part in the justice chain, but working together and say, okay, so this is where it starts. This is what we want in terms of individual resolutions, in terms of prevention, in terms of societal outcomes. So how do we work together to make that happen? And that's a very, very different type of approach. And that often leads to other types of solutions, not long procedures, but having personal contact, bringing people together, de-escalating conflicts, et cetera, et cetera. So I can talk more, but I know we're out of time, so I'll leave it at that. And thank you for this wonderful discussion.
Thank you, Maaike, and thank you all of you. Really stimulating. As always, we do better thinking when we think together and develop solutions together, and that's very much what the World Justice Challenge is all about, is convening a global community to identify not just the problems, but quite importantly, the solutions, and to share those across the community. The Q&A has been really a rich stream there, and I want to invite all the participants to subscribe to WJP's updates about the competition. We will be in the new year posting details about the finalists in the competition. We've had hundreds of applications, so there's going to be lots of good ideas coming to the fore. The finalists will have web pages and a knowledge platform where people can learn about their solutions, where they can interact with representatives of the finalist projects, pose questions, have the kind of exchange that we see in our Q&A chat in real time on this platform. And we can all continue to learn together over the coming months. Let me thank our panelists again, and IDLO and Pathfinders and the World Bank for joining with the World Justice Project in highlighting the challenges we see in access to justice and helping us find solutions. Thanks very much.